Welcome to the Beatitudes, episode 49. I'm Dr. Greg Popcak, and I'm talking with you today about the 12 habits of headship. We're going to be talking about what headship is from a Catholic perspective, and walking through the 12 habits of the Liturgy of Domestic Church Life, talking about what is Dad's role in facilitating this Liturgy of Domestic Church Life, and really exercising the kind of headship that allows our families to grow closer to Christ and each other. So before we get into the 12 habits that make up this Liturgy of Domestic Church Life, and regular viewers of this podcast or members of the CatholicHOM app are familiar with what this is all about. But if you're not, I'll just kind of give you some background. So in 2019, my organization, Pastoral Solutions, CatholicCounselors.com, combined with the OSV Institute and the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame, co-sponsored the Symposium on Catholic Family Life and Spirituality at Notre Dame, which was intended to really look at how could we renew Catholic family life. And it was a gathering of over 50 theologians, social scientists, pastoral ministry professionals, pastoral counselors. The executive leadership team from the USCCB Secretariat for Marriage and Family Life was there. And for 3 days, we presented research and had discussions about renewing Catholic family life and spirituality. What would it take to really help Catholics understand how Catholic couples and families are called to live differently than our Protestant and non-Christian counterparts? And it was a very interesting and important meeting because it helped to articulate what we now call the Liturgy of Domestic Church Life, which is the process by which a messy, busy, chaotic, crazy, normal, everyday family like all of our families, how do those kinds of families become domestic churches? What even is a domestic church, and how do we be that? So the short version, how does a domestic church differ from a kind of just normal family? So we, in our discussions, came up with a definition that a domestic church is a household of persons united to each other and God through the sacramental life of the church. Number one, because in order to be a domestic church or any kind of church, there have to be sacraments involved. You can't have a church without sacraments. Secondly, that to be a domestic church, that family, in addition to being united to God and each other through the sacramental life of the church, need to be committed in some way, at least, to living out the Christian, Trinitarian vision of love in their relationships with each other in the world, as opposed to our kind of broken human love. Because every family, says they love each other, but what does it mean to really live out the Catholic vision of love at home? And so Catholics are called, through church teaching, to kind of look at the love that exists between the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and see that free and total and faithful and fruitful love that exists between the persons of the Trinity and live that out in our daily lives. And that all sounds really complicated and highfalutin, and I get that. But we wanted to make that operational and kind of talk about what that actually meant in real life. So that's coming. So don't get too worried about the theology piece of it. But in terms of what is a domestic church and how is it different from an average family, it's that. It's that we actively cultivate connection to God and each other and the whole church through living the sacramental life together, going to Mass together, participating in all the sacraments together as a family, but then bringing that grace home so that we can live out God's vision of love instead of our own broken vision. And the 12 habits of the Liturgy of Domestic Church Life help us to do that. The idea of a liturgy, to say something as a liturgy, it's a word that we use a lot as Catholics, but don't really think about much in terms of what it actually means. So a liturgy is something that God has instituted that exists to heal the damage that sin has done to our relationships with God and each other. So, for instance, nobody came up with a way to turn bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. No scientist in a lab said, Eureka! Right? Jesus had to do that. So God instituted that sacrament of the Eucharist, the liturgy of the Eucharist. And he instituted it in order to heal the damage that sin had done to our ability to enjoy communion with God and with each other. And so because of the Eucharist, we are able, through Christ, to have eternal life and to celebrate communion with the whole communion of saints. The family is a similar thing. Nobody invented the family. Nobody in a lab said, this is what a family should be. And there are lots of people, in universities trying to reinvent what family is. But God at the beginning of time created family. And he built into his design of the family certain practices that when families do these things, enable them to thrive. And when united with God's grace through the sacraments, these practices that enable families to thrive also become a little way of holiness. So to say that something is a liturgy is that first, it means that God instituted it. It didn't come from human creativity. Secondly, it means that it's universal, that it doesn't just apply to some people but not to other people, that it's universally applicable. And so these practices that we've identified, these 12 practices, they come out of both our study of Catholic theology and what Catholic families are called to and how we're called to live. But it also comes from science, because we surveyed all the literature on family well-being and faith transmission and looked at what does the data say that is common to all families about that thrive, that love each other well, and that do a good job of passing on their faith to the next generation. And all families who are thriving, who are happy, who have good loving relationships, and who do a good job of passing on the faith to the next generation, frankly, whatever their faith is, have a tendency to follow certain habits that we would argue were hardwired by God into his design of the family. And those 12 habits make up what we call this liturgy of domestic church life. So when we use the phrase liturgy of domestic church life, what we mean is the original plan instituted by God when he created the family that enables families to thrive and be holy. Now, the piece where you come in as Catholic dads is that the research also shows that these things tend to stick best when dad's in charge of them. When dad at least is an active participant, but ideally when dad takes point in making them happen. So now, think about this. This becomes a model, a really uniquely Catholic model for headship. Because think about this, okay? Because Catholics think about the life of the Christian life through the liturgical lens. How do we do the work that God has asked us to do to heal the damage that sin has done to our ability to love God and each other? That's what liturgy is, right? It's the work that we do, that God has given us to do, that enables us to cooperate with his grace to heal the damage that sin does to our relationships with him and each other. So if there is a liturgy of domestic church life, if there is a way that common, messy, busy, crazy families can become domestic churches, and that those habits were built by God into his original design of the family, and those habits work best when dads take charge of them, now all of a sudden we have a liturgical model for headship. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Instead of thinking about headship in terms of a hierarchy or politics or power, we want to think about headship in terms of liturgy and a liturgical vision for headship. So the priest, right, the ministerial priesthood, so the ordained priest, is the head of the Mass, in a sense, right? He is the spiritual head of Mass. But it's not his show. He doesn't get to do whatever he wants with it. He doesn't get to tell the congregation, okay, now we're going to dance, or now we're going to do this part in Vulcan. I mean, he doesn't get to make stuff up. He's doing a particular work that God has prescribed him to do that makes the common holy and helps us grow in unity with each other and with God, and helps to heal the damage that sin does to our relationships by participating in the sacraments that he is administrating and he is celebrating with us. Well, in a similar way, we would suggest that the common priesthood, as in the exercise of our common priesthood, because that's a thing too. When we're all baptized, we receive a common priesthood from Christ, and it is a sharing in the same priesthood of Christ. Now, it's a different manifestation of priesthood than ministerial priesthood. So the ordained priesthood exists to celebrate the sacraments, particularly the liturgy of the Eucharist. But the common priesthood exists so that we can consecrate the world to Christ. And they're both a share in the one priesthood of Christ. but they're different priesthoods, right? So the ministerial priesthood exists to serve the common priesthood. The common priesthood exists to serve the world. Now, so what does that have to do with you? Well, the problem is a priesthood doesn't really exist without a liturgy. That's why we, for example, celebrate the liturgy of the Eucharist and the institution of holy orders on the same day, Holy Thursday, because you can't have one without the other. So when we talk about a common priesthood, it's difficult to really talk about that in a meaningful way because there's no liturgy attached to the common priesthood like there is to the ministerial priesthood. Now, technically, liturgists would say, well, it's the liturgy of the Eucharist because we all participate in that in different ways, and the common priesthood, we exercise that in some way through the celebration of the liturgy of the Eucharist, even though the ministerial priesthood presides over it. And that is all true. I'm not disputing any of that. But I would like to suggest that God gave us a liturgy of domestic church life over which men in particular, when we exercise our priesthood by presiding over the particular habits or rituals that accompany this liturgy of domestic church life, simple things like prioritizing family time, seeing to generous affection in the home, seeing to prompt generous, consistent, and cheerful attention to each other's needs, seeing to that we are practicing discipleship discipline, that we have rituals of connection for working, playing, talking, and praying together, and then different ways of serving each other in the world. That when dads take point on those practices, they stick better. They are more meaningful for families, kids get more out of it, and children are more likely to own those things and do them in their own families as adults. It's a bit like the relationship between the father and the wife, the husband and the wife, or the father and the mother, is a bit like the relationship, at least seen through this lens, between the pastor or the celebrant and the deacon. Right? Or the celebrant and a concelebrant at Mass. There are certain things that the celebrant can do that a deacon can't do as well or at all. Or certain things that a celebrant can do that a concelebrant may not do. That's not to say that the deacon's role or the concelebrant's role isn't important at Mass, but it is supportive. And if the deacon runs a communion service or celebrates a wedding, or participate in some other paraliturgy that the deacon is qualified to run, has a baptism, for example. Those are all things that a deacon can do. Those are important experiences in the life of the parish, and those are important things. But the deacon can't celebrate Mass, right? And even if he has a communion service, it's not the same thing as the Mass. Well, in a similar way, a wife and a mom can do these habits in the home, but they don't seem to have the same impact as if dad does them. And the reason for that, I've talked about this elsewhere, is that, for children, for the first couple of years, they still think that they're part of mom's body because they grew up inside of mom's body. So they actually think that mom's part of them till mid 24 months, somewhere around there. And they start understanding themselves as a separate person. Well, dad is the first other. So when it comes to spirituality, mom represents the things that I do personally, privately. So if mom is doing spiritual things, I see that as wiring my personal spirituality. If dad's doing spiritual things, that tells me how the world works. And if I want to participate in the world, I need to do those things too. So in a sense, mom packs kids' spiritual lunch, but it's dad's job to make sure that the kid takes it to school. So the habits that make up the liturgy of domestic church life tend to stick best when dad takes point in them, or at least is an active participant in them, similar to how you can have a communion service with a deacon, but you can't have a Mass. And so that's why I would say that it is our job as fathers to practice headship in a liturgical way, in a way that allows our families to participate in these habits that God created for families to thrive, and that, united with God's grace, enable families to be holy. And then when we take up that role, those habits tend to take root more effectively in our children's souls than they would if our wives were just doing them. So headship then, in a similar way that the priest is the head of Mass, but doesn't get to do whatever he wants. He has to facilitate the process that God gave him to lead God's family to holiness, and to help God's family encounter communion with God and each other. Well, it's our job as exercising our common priesthood of the laity in our homes to celebrate the liturgy of domestic church life that takes our families, our busy, crazy, broken, struggling families, and helps them become, through God's grace, domestic churches by celebrating this liturgy of domestic church life and really taking point on those practices that enable us to do that. So this is a different vision, a very Catholic vision of headship that tells us that being heads of the home, being spiritual leaders in the home, doesn't mean that we get to boss our family around. Just like being the head of Mass doesn't mean that the celebrant doesn't get to boss the congregants around. We are both the ministerial priesthood and the common priesthood of being a dad. We're both serving a greater mission that God created. And when we do that, we have this liturgical role in our families that enables us to exercise certain habits that make up this liturgy of domestic church life, where we, as Catholic dads, facilitate the transformation of our families into something holy and something beautiful and something more than just the crazy, busy, struggling thing that we can make it be on our own. So over the next several episodes of the Beatitudes, I'm going to be talking about those 12 habits and how you can exercise headship by really seeing to those habits that help to create an orderly, healthy, holy family life. And to see your role as head of the home and spiritual leader in the home, again, not in hierarchical or political or power-based terms, but through a liturgical lens that enables you to see the work that God is calling you to do and to take charge of the habits that God created when he built the family so that your family can thrive and be the holy domestic church it was created to be. So stay tuned and let's talk through those habits and how we as dads can really take point in making them happen so that our families can become those dynamic domestic churches.